Hello and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This episode is going to cover episode 4, parts 8 and 9 of my Let's Play, and will contain spoilers for the entirety of Umineko, so it will assume you know the entire story and will not make sense if you don't. Also, the section we're covering is going to contain a lot of child abuse, bullying, child neglect, physical child abuse, and associated anxieties. It's going to be very heavily discussed, so all of those things will be very prevalent, and some of them will be displayed from scenes of the game too. Again, in that case mostly in text, but still enough that if you have a sensitivity, this episode may be difficult. I will mark a little CW content warning thing on the timestamps for any of these sections where that will be occurring, but I do think it will be quite a bit of this episode. But before we get into all of the truly depressing stuff, I'm going to talk about a lightly depressing thing, which is the way in which Ange is using her magic. We begin the first section where she is in her happy place. She's remembering a memory of her and her family being happy, a place where she particularly feels a connection to Battler as well. And she has her entire cast of friends, and she has the magical power to animate them quite actively. There's a lot of references to magical power, and what's interesting is that in some ways, magical power is less a function of having a lot of reserves of anything, as much as it is an ability to prevent doubts or a kind of false maturity. It's to prevent you having the thought that this is ridiculous. It's to prevent you going, none of this is true, this is all just made up, this is bullshit, and devaluing things in that way, because it's less even, it's not the case, as sometimes happens in stories of things like this, that Ange, escapism is a fairly common theme and plotline for characters of children who are in bad situations, and some stories take a line where the idea is that the character has completely lost touch with reality, and that reality and their magical world are blurred or incomprehensible or indistinguishable in a way that is toxic and concerning for the character. Umineko is not presenting things this way. A funny thing about Umineko is how many times layers are distinct. The meta layer of Beatrice and Battler on their game board is fully distinct from the game board. Even though there are ways that things bleed over between those, there's never a sense in Umineko that it is hard to maintain that distinction. In the same way, Ange here is having fun playing in this fantasy land. She's not unclear on the fact that this is distinct from the world around her that she is about to return to, St. Lucia's. But what her magical power is an ability to not engage her brain in tearing down the world she is creating. It's the point I was getting at is it's not so much that she is believing in this manufactured magical reality as an objective true reality. It's more about coming to a sense of thinking this reality matters and does still mean something to Ange. It still brings her comfort, it still brings her joy. These are a collection of imaginary friends and the memory of a cousin she misses. These are all things that are real. Ange has no illusions about the objective reality of this situation, but she is still, her magical power is such that she's both able to accept the reality of what these people bring to her and imagine a rich life for these people. Because that's the other half of magical power as it's being discussed here, is its imagination. That's going to be even more important later when we get to Toya and when we get to far future Ange, both of whom write books, and their imagination going into those books is a magical power that's very powerful and developed when they get to those points. In different ways. And so we see Ange effectively at the height of her power here, right on the precipice of it falling apart as, unfortunately, the real world, the factual world, for lack of a better term, is going to hammer again and again on the limitations of what this magical thinking does for her. Because at the end of the day, the problem with this comfort is that it does not provide coping mechanisms for Ange. And in thinking about it, there's an interesting, and I don't know if it's entirely intentional contrast, but Maria's coping mechanisms with Sakutaro, with her little other friends, the rabbits, Maria's coping mechanisms help her to get by better. Sakutaro gets Maria to make healthier food choices at times. Sakutaro helps Maria go to school without being miserable by suggesting she can take tiny friends with her. Not all of these things go by okay, because we have sections about that we'll probably talk a little bit more about, but ultimately Sakutaro functions as a voice that helps Maria get by a little better. Obviously there's the overall need that both Ange and Maria have of a source of happiness in their lives, but there's other ways in which Sakutaro somewhat helps Maria Sakutaro helps Maria cope with being a person as well, whereas Ange actually ends up having the opposite situation a lot. The thing that often, again, is a theme of escapism and stuff is the idea that the person who is escaping is then not engaging with the real world in the ways that they need to. Ange's obviously older than Maria was for her flashback sections, and Ange has more responsibilities that affect the other people around her, and obviously Ange is a sympathetic character and is in a shitty situation and is the victim of bullying, but I do also get the impression in these sections that Ange is neglecting her life around her. Ange has detached from other people so wholly that even with regards kids who might not be bullying her, she's not engaging. She is not even trying or paying attention. We have the section of the magical stuff happening where Ange's ostensibly reading a book, and in a funny way I guess Mammon is trying to get her to read further on, but Ange closes the book and says, "Nah, I'm just gonna have fun playing now." And I don't think the game is condemning Ange or trying to insinuate that she is the cause of her troubles because of doing that, but I think there is an undercurrent of the difference in here where Ange has the magical power to make herself feel better, but Ange in some ways could be doing more to actively improve her situation in ways that Maria can't necessarily. Maria is doing what she can to get by and do her best to survive as a person. Again, we're going to be talking about that with the childcare person, the social worker who appears. But Ange has a little bit more agency in things. And again, I'm not going to victim blame. I'm not going to suggest that Ange should have done better on her tests and that everything would have been fine. But there is a degree to which Ange's actions lead to the result that comes. She didn't study for a test, and that instigates bullying. That is not her fault, but theoretically could have been avoided. But she was distracted with her magical world. And the thing that happens is Ange wants her magical world to just dissolve her problems. She wants the Seven Sisters of Purgatory to kill all her classmates who are bullying her. And when they can't do that, she declares them useless. She will not even take the comfort she had been having up until that point when there is a discomfort that cannot be whisked away. And I think you could extrapolate out of that too that She was not willing to have a version of the magical world where her friends helped her to study or helped her to do a little better with different things in the school so she could get by. In some ways, Ange just wants to disengage and doesn't accept the fact that sometimes that is actually making things worse, even as she continues to do it. In this section, Ange and Maria talk about the differences between resurrection, summoning, and creation, and it's interesting that Ange's ultimate goal, her intention, is to resurrect her family, but she was instead going to become a creator. She is going to go write books. She's going to make magical worlds that inspire other children and people who are in bad situations, while Toya will be doing some resurrection. Apologies, by the way, if my names are wrong. I've not looked this up and I don't remember. The naming situation with Toya is complex, to say the least, but you know what I'm referring to broadly. Toya is the one who will resurrect the Ashura Miyas in a series of tales of what could have happened on Rokkenjima, and resurrect them quite faithfully in a way that Ange cannot, because Ange doesn't have enough memories of those people. Ange doesn't know her family that well. And that's actually a big limiter. I said before that even with her own parents, she doesn't have a talisman to resurrect them the way her hair clips can help, her hair ties can help her theoretically resurrect Battler. But she was genuinely so young when her family was alive that her memories are probably far too inconsistent and vague for even her own parents, let alone her aunts, uncles, and cousins that she'd see once a year. And then we get to a scene of some very intense bullying of Ange, and we begin to see the limitations of her coping mechanisms because the stakes of purgatory begin to give their own takes on how unfair the people around her are, and they suggest things she could do leaning into the various aspects, but at the same time, how much can Ange do in this situation? None of their advice quite feeds into something that is actionable. There truly is no solution to this situation. There are maybe choices one could make that might be more productive than others, but when you are in the moment, when you're being surrounded by so many people ganging up on you, there is not a lot of options available to you. But to me, the bigger tragedy is that this is the moment where Ange fully falls into the notion that only concrete, objective and tangible help matters. Up until now, the stakes of purgatory have offered a kind of escape, a respite, and friends that she doesn't have in any of the girls around her in her school. These are all welcome things that have helped Ange get through the days, but in this moment when she is being directly targeted and harassed by all this bullying, just having her friends present and talking is not enough, and then she demands of them to kill everyone around her, which isn't possible. By the nature of magic, you need things to line up such that things like that would be possible. They're not in a position to do something like that. And that, in some ways, reveals an impotency of magic and how much magic can do. This foreshadows an impending stage of the game where Beatrice is going to become massively undermined, and the amount of power on display is about to go way down. And to Ange, this is proof and vindication of a concern, a worry she has had for a while, that she's just playing around and wasting her time with magic nonsense, and Ange takes their lack of tangible ability, and to her that means that they are pointless. They are nothing. It is not that they cannot fix this one situation for her, but that if they can't fix this, they can't do anything. And we know that's not true, because we know the kind of comfort they have offered her in other situations. But this is where Ange loses sight of that and turns her back on it. And even more than that, this is Ange's moment of punching down. I've said before many times that a lot of the bullying, a lot of the abuse in these dynamics comes from people of higher power basically taking things out on people of lower power. And then those people need someone else of lower power to take things out on. And so Ange, as the dedicated witch of the school, is how a lot of these unhappy kids find a way to vent their frustrations. Ange's the bottom rung of the social order in this situation, but she can take things out on her imaginary friends. She can blame her friends for their inability to actionably do anything. Which, if you think about it in the abstract sense, is incredibly unfair. Ange's main frustration with all of her friends is that they can't do anything. Which is an unfair criticism because that's not their fault. Their inability to actionably do something, to tangibly do something, is a limitation on them. It's not that they're choosing not to help her. It would be one thing if they could do something and they were withholding it, but Ange knows that's not the case, and that's why Ange gets so frustrated. So her smashing all of her friends because they can't tangibly do something, because they don't have the ability to help her the way they would if they could, it is just her needing an outlet. In the same way she needed a respite and she needed a safe space before, she now needs someone else to take out her frustrations on after being bullied for literal hours. One thing that I enjoy in this section is it ties together the disparate and strange timelines that we've had in this episode so far, and we're going to get more confusing threads that eventually weave together, but there's a very good connecting tissue here where we see school-age Ange of the future, and she, having lost faith again in magic, repeats things that a child very much younger Ange said to Maria when Maria was still alive, where it flows from Ange's ultimate despair to insisting that Sakutaro didn't exist, he's just a stuffed animal. And Maria's reaction to that ends up getting picked up in the next section as we go back to Maria's story. Clearly in the aftermath of the incident that had Ange kicked out of Mariage Sorcière, where Ange, insisting that magic was not real, deeply wounded Maria and her limited coping mechanisms. But first, to just finish out Ange's section here, Ange using the term cage of flesh in the exact same way that Beatrice does is a good moment for, again, hammering on just different ways people can be trapped in their physical bodies and how they might escape them through magical means, but also to draw a good parallel where Ange and Beatrice, they suffered in different ways, but very much both suffered and despite how Ange feels because of the character of Beatrice that was projected, the person that Ange is so angry at also had a terrible upbringing in various ways. Again, the terrible depending on your point of view and how you want to interpret things, to be fair, but Ange would certainly have a sympathetic read and would think it was terrible, given how she reacts to Maria's upbringing. And then we come to the conclusion of this section of Maria's story. And in particular, I think there's some interesting moments when Maria kind of breaks, where she has lost the key that is her only way of getting back into her apartment and her only means of having a place to sleep for the night. And this is where I do think there's a little bit more truth to what Ange thinks of Maria's situation than Maria in this episode is necessarily willing to admit to. I think it is overly harsh and rude to insinuate that Maria was a poor soul with no light in her life. But I think the stress and strain of the situation of simply having dropped her key really brings out the burden placed on Maria. The fact that Maria has to be so capable of being independent without ever having to call her mother about the slightest thing is not a tenable situation for such a young child. I don't think that's hard to understand, but at the same time, it still bears underlining the complete absence of any support Maria has in this situation. It is not just that Maria is left out in the cold for her dinner. Her mother would not be back for days. If Maria was not picked up by the police officer who rescues her, she would have nowhere to go. She wouldn't even think to ask the shopkeepers for help because Maria knows how badly that will reflect on her mother. Even in the ways where Maria does not fully conceptualize the kind of covering she is doing for her mother, she still understands on a subconscious level that she should not involve people in cases of her mother leaving her alone. She somewhat knows it shouldn't be happening, and so she tries to avoid the topic until forced to, because she literally has nowhere to sleep without someone doing something like this. But in particular, some interesting lines. As Maria is crying, the narration says it wasn't her fault, so it was someone else's fault. But Maria didn't know who that someone was, and could do nothing but continue to let out a moan of anger. Now, to parallel this to Ange's situation, Ange took out her frustration on her imaginary friends. Maria does not do this with Sakutaro. Maria only despairs, having no person to take this out on, having no person to blame. Even though in Maria's situation there is a much more concrete person to blame, her mother. But Maria can't bring herself to do that. Partly because Maria loves her mother, and partly because the power dynamics are such that Maria just can't. Maria does not have the power to criticize and blame her mother in that way. Maria is just the child. She is just below her mother and has no recourse for any of the poor treatment her mother inflicts upon her. But at the same time, there is an interesting binary of, if it's not Maria's fault, it has to be someone else's. It can't simply be an unfortunate accident, say that she lost her key, and that's awful and she'll do her best to fix it. The claim is made that it has to be someone else's fault. Because there should be someone to blame, even if Maria doesn't get to have a target of a person to blame. After this, I have some words for the district welfare officer that, just like Ange's magical friends, is utterly impotent in actually helping Maria in her situation. There's some fun parallels between these sections, and one of them is that the real world people engaging with Maria's problem don't do a lot to help her. I alluded to this somewhat earlier with the shopkeepers who try to be kind to Maria, but ultimately are not offering a lot of meaningful help. the police officer and the shopkeeper who called him, they help to keep Maria from having to sleep on the street, which would be terrible, of course. But in terms of long-term solutions, I don't quite know what timescale we're operating on from here to the family conference, but nowhere ever again is there any mention of Maria possibly being taken away from Rosa. Now, broad Higurashi spoilers, but if you have played Higurashi, you will know that that's a very intentional choice on Ryukishi's part, because he is gesturing at an unwillingness or an inability of the welfare officer to actually do something. As much as a group of magical sisters cannot solve the problem of you being bullied, the teacher coming in at the end and rescuing Ange is not strictly speaking solving the problem long term. He's getting her out of that situation, but I don't think Ange left that school. I don't think Ange got mental health support. I don't think Ange was helped to find a path forward of what to do with her life and to not be stuck on memories of what could have been. I think she maybe got out of one bad situation and then the society around her failed to give her any more support than that. So at the end of the day, can you really say that the magical sisters are that much less useful than a welfare officer who calls Maria a poor thing and talks to her mother but actionably does nothing? I also think calling Maria a poor thing is in some ways as bad as calling Sakutaro cloth and cotton wool. Maria has forged her coping mechanisms to get through the day, to find ways to be happy, and to genuinely make herself happy as best she can. So to have this welfare officer come in and say, "Oh, you're deeply unhappy," and I'm being very harsh on this welfare officer, I get the impression she tried, somewhat, to do something, but when the results are nothing, it's very hard to really give her much credit. And in many ways, she only makes things worse, somewhat by making Maria feel worse in a tiny moment, but ultimately because she only enrages Rosa more, and Rosa, unwilling again to think about whose fault all this really is, instead finds scapegoats. Scapegoats in Maria and Maria's actions, and then in Maria's toys, as if the toys themselves are the problem. As if Maria's coping mechanisms that she has scrounged out of what she can, those are the reason that any of this happened. It's not that perhaps her young child was left with a key and no other support mechanism to get into her house. It's because Maria went out with her stuffed bear. The fact that the shopkeepers took notice of her enough to call the police, that's definitely what the problem is. And I will say, a lot of why I am so harsh on this welfare officer is, one of the things she says is, shouldn't a mother be together with her child? This is a real problem with how a lot of these things are dealt with. There is a massive bias towards the idea that a mother should be with her child, even in cases where the mother might not want to, might be unfit, might be abusive. There's an inclination to think that things should be resolved as is. Things should not be changed. The child should not be put into a different situation. We should just try to nudge things such that the natural state of things of a mother and her child should be fixed. And that's the vibe I get from the welfare officer. And I cannot help but suspect that that may be a large part of why Maria does not get taken away. And there is no indication of Maria being taken away. When we see Rosa going to the family conference, there's no hint of her being worried that the welfare officer is even watching her. It's only her general discomfort with the fact that people notice her being abusive to her child, but there's no actual consequences. There's no tangible possibility of Maria being taken from her. And one part of this section that I think is important to highlight is the ways in which, at this moment, Rosa does not lay a finger on Maria herself, but in some ways does worse damage as she violently attacks things in the apartment and the wall. And there's a literal line that says, of course, she didn't make direct contact with Maria. However, the violence of the harsh sound certainly beat against her. So the threat is still tangible. The fear it instills is still there. And we know she will also hit Maria in other situations. So it is the worst of both worlds. But even at that, a lot of the damage Rosa is doing in this section is reinforcing the anti-magic toxin. Rosa is both outright saying, Sakataro's just a stuffed animal, he is not your friend, as well as insisting that... as well as, for the very first time out of anyone we've seen, calls out Sakataro's lines as being things Maria is saying. Maria says Sakataro's lines for him since he's the body of a stuffed animal. He cannot speak for himself. But Rosa is the only person, at least thus far, who is responding with that understanding. Everyone until now has been in dialogue with Sakataro, and obviously a lot of them have been magical friends, but even the shopkeepers, even if they don't strictly respond to Sakataro, don't call out the notion that Maria is the one speaking, whereas Rosa does, and doesn't even entertain the notion that these might be things someone else is saying. These are all things Maria is saying, and if you read you can't read the conversation any other way. And as Beatrice will say a little bit later, Rosa, as technically being the creator of Sakataro and the original creator of the rabbits, she has much more power to destroy them. Because a lot of Maria's magic that has gone into these friends comes from taking them as proof of her mother's love. And so it is a double whammy of her mother both undermining her belief in her imaginary friend and destroying the present that she gave to Maria that Maria could cling to as proof that her mother cared. Also, really top 5 awful parenting moments. The fact that this is all news to Rosa speaks both to how little attention Rosa pays to her daughter, and speaks to how much Maria has to hide these things from Rosa. Rosa has not heard her speak as Sakataro because Maria makes sure not to speak as Sakataro in front of her mother, knowing how poorly that will go. And so Rosa, having thought, oh, my daughter's a bit weird, to in this moment understanding who her daughter really is and being horrified, it's terrible parenting, absolute worst, awful woman. Again, sorry, awful woman, awful. She knows what she's doing when she's breaking the rabbits because she's using them as a threat to try and cajole Maria into behaving. She understands that this is something Maria cares about, so she weaponizes it as a punishment. To which the social worker replies, like, you think you can do something and like that and not hurt your daughter? To which Rosa replies, I'm also hurting, right? Who's going to take responsibility for my wounds? This fucking woman who's been on holidays with her boyfriend while her child had to sleep in a police station. Again, real clear indication of how awful Rosa is. And irredeemable in many ways. The only way you could ever really redeem Rosa is because you want Maria to have a mother, which is what this social worker is doing, but also I think Maria would, as bad as orphanages and other situations can also be, I still think Maria would be better off. But none of this becomes a material problem because of the incident of Rokkenjima. Which brings us to the ending of this section, which hit me like a truck this time, honestly, because I did not remember this. I had not remembered the extent to which Maria was a key motivation for Beatrice. It's clear in the first 2 episodes how Beatrice is doing this for Maria. I had completely forgotten that, as if you take the scene as having happened, Maria asked for this. That Maria got pushed far enough that she actually asked Beatrice for this help. And that has really changed my understanding of Beatrice's motivation in one sense, because I have wondered a little bit about the thought leading up to the weekend, up to the family conference, from Beatrice's perspective, because I fully empathize with Beatrice's situation, and it's pretty awful, but it had not been clear to me the extent to which she is also doing it because Maria's situation has become increasingly untenable and has no solutions. Maria does not have a way to fix her relationship with her mother, and if I remember right, Maria's 8 at this time. Maria's got a lot more years of being alone with her mother and having no way to get out. Unless Maria gets sent to a boarding school, which doesn't seem like a good prospect for her, given how it went for Ange. And again, Beatrice, in her own situation, not feeling like she has a lot of options, despite having a mountain of money, still feeling like she is trapped. I increasingly can see why this may have been a key impetus in Beatrice actually resolving to do this. And it's just huge, because in this conversation, Beatrice seems much more reluctant and much less willing to do this than we have seen previously. And I think some of that is probably meant to be slowly unraveling the idea of Beatrice as this iconically evil woman, and starting to think more about her as a person, and to overall complicate your understanding of her. Again, we're going to have a moment later in this episode where literally completely comically evil Beatrice hands off to sad, unfortunate Beatrice who just wanted her man to come back to her. And so I think that is part of this, but from reading the section, I do also get the feeling that Beatrice may have thought about how she could do this kind of thing at a family conference, but more than I had ever realized, Maria is a key part of her coming to the conclusion to do it. Which makes sense in that if Beatrice does this, she is killing, if not Maria herself, Maria's entire family. But if Maria literally asked for it, and if this is how Beatrice feels like she can in any way help Maria in a way that no one else can, I can believe how this would happen. Also, again, just some tough lines in this section. Why did Mama make it herself and break it herself? Why did Mama give birth to it by herself and try to break it herself? I don't understand. I don't understand. Maria here is obviously talking about Sakutaro, but Maria's talking about herself. Maria does not understand why she has a mother who brought her into this world only to have no interest in her and to actively oppress Maria and shove her in a box and constantly cajole her out of being who she is. And honestly, I would struggle to explain this. I would not expect an 8-year-old to be able to understand how her mother could get to this situation, and I would certainly not say that the 8-year-old should bear the brunt of the mother's choices. And that concludes the most of the backstory section of this. We'll have a little bit with Ange next time before we get back into the actual incident in Rokkenjima. And I am not yet sure how much conversation there will be to have as the rest of this Rokkenjima weekend unfolds. So I'm looking forward to playing more of that and getting a better idea of what's going on. But until then, thank you for watching and see you in the next one.